This is video 1 of the Effective Child Protection training course for child protection practitioners. Section 1 provides an introduction to effective child protection.
My name is David Paul of Gwynedd Council's Children and Supporting Family Service. I'm a social worker and developed the risk model with Bruce Thornton several years ago. That work is seen in the thresholds part of effective child protection. I developed effective child protection more recently with colleagues from Gwynedd Council.
Effective child protection is a practice framework for practitioners in child protection in the United Kingdom. Developed by Gwynedd Council in North Wales, this framework has been created to model enhanced ways of working in child protection. It is practice-based and developed by staff who are currently working in frontline practice in North Wales. Supported by all 6 North Wales authorities as a way of developing new practical ways of making child protection more effective. This introduction will present the effective child protection model and the structure of the training course. This training course is delivered through a series of short videos which are numbered sequentially. I encourage you to work through these in order. From the downloads page on the practice resource module, you will find a workbook to accompany this course. It has all the exercises with instructions and templates to complete. In addition, there is a copy of the video presentations and notes. As a prerequisite to beginning this course, we recommend that you have sufficient understanding and experience in child protection. This course is not a training course in child protection, or how to undertake an investigation or an introduction to basic practice. This is an advanced training course that has been developed on the assumption that child protection practitioners will have the necessary experience to understand and appreciate the material. It is also expected that practitioners will have access to their own material or material related to a case that they are familiar with. In the training course, you will be asked to read your own material and analyse it. This helps to contextualise these new ideas in a practical way to real-life case examples. For this course, you are asked to have access to a child protection report that you have written yourself. Good examples are reports to case conferences or child protection assessments. This effective child protection course includes 12 videos, including this one. The course has an accompanying workbook that can be used to record your progress through the various exercises. You will also need to have some of your own case material to use on the course. The course includes both information that explains the model as well as a series of exercises. This first video is an introduction to effective child protection and explains the 4 components of the model, and these are conversations, thresholds, change, and measure. The effective child protection course focuses mainly on the change and measure elements of the model. There are separate courses and practice material for collaborative conversations and threshold elements. In this course, the first 3 videos are exercises for you to consider. What change means in your own life, how change is presented in your own reports, and how you develop a change statement from your own case example. Videos 5 and 6 provide some explanation of how to write a good change statement and how to work with the what needs to change grid. These provide information about how the model should be used. In video 7, exercise 4, we return to the change statement you developed earlier and refine this in light of the explanation and instructions you will have received. Videos 8 and 9 provide instruction about the measure elements of the model and how to develop the steps to change. Video 10 is another exercise where you can put the ideas into practice to develop the steps to change using your own case material. Video 11 looks at disguised compliance and how effective child protection can be a guard against disguised compliance. In the last video, video 12, we recap all the material and make connections between the various elements. So let's start at the beginning. I will start by explaining why effective child protection was developed. I was asked to explain how our numbers of children being brought into care were increasing. This was the argument. If child protection processes take place before a child is taken into care, with the aim of reducing harm, why are more children coming into care? Is this not an indication of a failure of child protection? How do we know that child protection is effective? Child protection is about change. We start with circumstances where the care provided to a child is not good enough. What do we mean with not good enough? It is a level of care that is established through assessment. For statutory intervention to be triggered, the level of concern is that a child is at risk of significant harm. So when we talk about care not being good enough in child protection, what we mean is that the child is suffering or likely to suffer significant harm in the future. The aim of child protection is to ensure that their care is good enough. And good enough is a reduction of risk of harm, and as a minimum, that the child is no longer at risk of significant harm. To move from not good enough to good enough care, there has to be change in the circumstances of a child. This is often related to the behaviour of parents. If effective child protection is successful change, what contributes to our ability to promote change? Effective child protection is a practice framework focused on change. It brings together 4 components that contribute to ensuring change. These are collaborative conversations with families about change, discussions that motivate and avoid generating resistance. Secondly, good and consistent decisions about significant harm, so that threshold is tested and there is clarity about when care is not good enough and child protection actions are justified. Thirdly, practice that focuses on change, focuses on the change necessary to achieve good enough care, change that is linked to the risk of significant harm, keeping focus on this change and clearly communicating it to families. And lastly, practice that measures its progress in achieving change, so that families have an understanding of the journey, their successes, and clarity about what still needs to be done. These 4 components are represented as 4 jigsaw pieces. Each piece of the jigsaw represents an important element. Individually applied, they will enhance child protection practice. And the model brings all of these together as a framework for intervention. One of the most important things that contributes to effective child protection are the conversations we have with families. Child protection often focuses on failure and concerns. As practitioners, one of the challenges we have is that talking about concerns, criticism, and failure generates resistance in families. And if we have conversations where parents become defensive, it becomes very difficult to work with them on change. Motivational interviewing and collaborative communication are two approaches to having better conversations with people where the practitioner consciously thinks about how they talk to families where there are child protection concerns. The principle is that to keep children safe, we need to be having better and more effective conversations with families. We need to think about the way we talk with individuals to facilitate their participation, control, change, and ownership. We need to use techniques such as collaborative conversations or motivational interviewing techniques where possible. Social Care Wales has a programme called Collaborative Communication, which provides the skill base for better conversations. There is more information about these in the practice resources. When we look at having better conversations about keeping children safe, what do we mean? What are some of the practices that we'd want to see? If we go back to 2011, Professor Eileen Munro said that telling people what to do is rarely effective in practice. This is said because telling people what to do tends to make people defensive. Telling people what to do tends to come from a criticism of them. And because child protection practitioners often have concerns and are managing high levels of risk, they have a lot of power and control in people's lives. These factors, criticism, power, and control, create barriers that get in the way of developing the working relationship with families that is key to promoting change. So, collaborative conversations and motivational interviewing is a very purposeful focus on how we communicate. It seeks to avoid creating these situations of defensiveness and conflict. As a practical example of how we can do this in practice, one of the great antidotes to getting trapped in this cycle of criticism and defensiveness is to focus on strengths. Sometimes this is introduced as starting conversations by focusing on strengths before we start to talk about risks or concerns. It changes the direction of the conversation. Starting with strengths is a particular feature of the collaborative communications model. We recognise, of course, that there will be tensions about this and whether it is possible to maintain this focus on strengths in some challenging situations. It is, however, a good discipline to try and start there. And if we can't, we are at least aware that this conversation is particularly difficult. We can focus on how we're communicating and take extra care to avoid some pitfalls. When we think about participation and cooperation, how do we promote this? Think about how we see families who place their children at risk of harm. How do we regard these families? Are we positive about them? Are we able to be non-judgmental? Do we believe in their potential to change? Do we have conversations about change in an inquiring and exploratory way? Do we start conversations thinking about the hopelessness of their situation? We recognise that we are wrestling with these internal dilemmas in day-to-day practice. The simplicity of starting conversations with a family's strengths can be an antidote to our tendencies otherwise to criticise. Thresholds. Throughout the discussion about effective child protection, we will refer to the likelihood of significant harm as the threshold for statutory intervention. This comes from the Children Act 1989, which places the duty to investigate abuse on local authorities. Whether there is likelihood of significant harm or not can be determined through a risk assessment. This tests the threshold of significant harm. When Professor Munro looked into the tragic death of baby Peter, she drew focus on some principles. One of these is that decisions taken by social workers should be consistent and of a high quality. Using a framework such as the risk model structures the assessment and provides assurance that there will be consistency between workers completing a risk assessment. The practice resource provides further guidance and a comprehensive introduction to undertaking a risk assessment. When we look at decision making that is of high quality and consistent between practitioners, what do we mean? Here, we are making decisions about something very specific. The question is there a likelihood of significant harm in this case? It is this significant harm concept which is the test in children's services. The image is of a yes or no. You can think of it as a switch on or off. It is whether the threshold is met or not. There is a more detailed explanation about significant harm and risk 2, the risk assessment tool, in the practice resources. This explains how to come to such a decision. I will not repeat it here as it is worthy of more detailed attention. However, it is worthwhile for us to consider why this is important. Remember that the Children Act 1989 places a duty to investigate abuse on local authorities. This means that if you have reasonable grounds to suspect a child is at risk of significant harm, you will investigate. This is a powerful duty. In making the inquiries, we can do so without the parent's consent. There are a range of powers available to intervene without consent in the private lives of families. So, on one hand, if you decide you have grounds, you fundamentally interfere with the rights of families to privacy. And if you do not have grounds, you must respect the rights of families to self-determine without the oversight of the state. So, on one hand, we act to uphold the rights of children to be protected from abuse. And on the other side, we don't act directly, and in doing so, allow the family to continue their lives without state intervention. Most of all, we are worried about getting it wrong. The consequences could be a child suffering harm because our assessment was incorrect. And of course, the flip side is that a family is subject to scrutiny and attention where there are no grounds to undermine their rights to private life. It is important to get this decision about significant harm right. The risk model is a framework to support practitioners in making this decision. This training focuses specifically on 2 of the areas of the effective child protection model. These are change and measure. Child protection is about change. We start with circumstances where the care provided to a child is not good enough. Through intervention, we hope to achieve care that is good enough. This move from not good enough to good enough requires change. We need to be very clear about what needs to change. This change will be what is necessary to reduce the risk of significant harm. In this training, we will focus on writing a statement of change. This is a statement of the outcome desired in the case to reduce the likelihood of significant harm. This focus on change must be maintained throughout the child protection process. Effective child protection encourages a focus on no more than 5 areas of change at any one time, ideally no more than 3. This allows targeted intervention to the areas of greatest concern, reducing the difficulties that arise when practitioners try to attend to too many issues at once. This will be explored in this training. When we talk about change in effective child protection, there are a few key principles we need to remember. Firstly, when we talk about change, we are focusing on moving from care, which is not good enough, to care, which is good enough. Moving from a concern about the likelihood of significant harm to circumstances where significant harm is no longer likely. And the change we're focusing on is directly linked to the risk of significant harm. It is those changes which are of interest in effective child protection. We focus on no more than 5 areas of change, ideally no more than 3. The change has to be understood by the family, a shared understanding, using their own words where possible. And lastly, keeping the focus on change consistently as you work through the child protection process. These changes are a silver thread that weaves through the discussions with families. How do we know we are making progress towards safer outcomes? How do we know that we are making progress on those 3 areas of change related to significant harm? The Social Services and Wellbeing Wales Act 2014 introduced the requirement to identify and monitor progress towards well-being outcomes. Effective child protection has developed some ideas about how we do this and map our plan about how we intend to achieve change. This has to engage and be meaningful for parents. Steps to Change is a tool that structures change talk, encouraging a clear journey for the family towards good enough care. Once this journey is mapped with the family for each area of change, the Steps to Change approach can track progress. So our approach to measure encourages collaborative conversations with families as we develop our Steps to Change. It should achieve clarity about what needs to change and how a family is intending to work towards this outcome. The Steps to Change tool in effective child protection is central to how we weave the focus on change on the mechanism to measure progress. This meets the requirement to measure outcomes. Practically, it provides a statement of the agreement with families about how you intend to progress together. It has the potential to fall into the trap of other tools. The risk that the tool becomes more important than its purpose. The tool promotes change talk. It structures the conversation with families about change. Whilst it may well be written in the Steps tool, it is the conversation with the family that is critical to promoting change. When we bring all of this together, we see a model of 4 components, each addressing a key factor that makes child protection more effective. We can't intervene without having effective conversations with families, so we actively try to avoid generating the resistance that can get in the way of change. And we have to be confident about our decisions. so that if there is likelihood of significant harm, we can purposefully intervene to change those risks. And we need to keep focused, avoid getting distracted, focusing on the 3 or so changes that will reduce significant harm. And as we work, we have a collaborative plan for intervention and a way of knowing whether we are making progress. What have you learned? You can pause the video to complete your workbook. Reflect on the discussion so far. Was this easy to understand? What are other things that you think are important to making child protection effective? Anything you disagree with so far? Do you remember why this was developed, and what is the most important thing to remember? Do you remember the 4 components? Which one did you find most interesting? And why? Once you have completed section 1 of the Effective Child Protection course, please progress to the next part, which is video 2, exercise 1, personal change.